REDMAGIC is back with the Astra 2, and this might be the small gaming tablet to beat. Hey everyone, Retro Tech Dad here, and I'm super excited about this one since if you recognize this packaging, I've got something new here from REDMAGIC, which means it's time to make a return to the world of Android tablets. So let's quickly crack this seal open and dive into REDMAGIC's new gaming tablet, better known as the Astra 2 for the global market. And so with that, what do we get here with the new Astra 2? And there will be some similarities here to the prior generation, starting with the return of the 9.06-inch 1610 OLED display, which features a resolution of 2400 by 1504, and for the Astra 2, REDMAGIC has upped the refresh rate capabilities to 185 Hz. This display is capable of up to 1600 nits of peak brightness with a beautiful 90.1% screen-to-body ratio that features only a 4.9mm bezel and is protected by Corning's Gorilla Glass 3. The display is definitely one of the standouts here with the Astra 2, much like its predecessor, and the same holds true for this generation. And with a new generation comes a new generation of Snapdragon. And this time around, the Astra 2 is powered by the very capable Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 chipset, which is one that we have looked at here before on the channel. And I'm excited to make a return to this chipset as there's been some awesome developments for the software front that we can examine again with the Astra 2. The 8 Elite Gen 5 is an 8-core chipset that features the 3rd generation Orion core with up to 4.6 GHz, and is paired with the Adreno 840 GPU. Both of these promise improved performance, but also improved efficiency. The Astra 2 will be available in 2 different configurations at launch, featuring 12GB of LPDDR5T RAM and 256GB of UFS 4.1 Pro internal storage, and then a 16GB and 512GB model, with both being offered in 2 different colors: the Eclipse, which is the black version, and then Starfrost, which is the silver model. The unit I have on hand here for testing is the 16GB 512GB model in Eclipse. Sadly, much like many other REDMAGIC products, including the original Astra, we do not have a microSD slot for storage expansion. And this time around, at least for the global launch, we don't have an option for 1TB of internal storage. So this is definitely a huge bummer because, as we will find out soon enough, the Astra 2 has a lot of power under the hood to enjoy some very high-end gaming, especially when talking about PC gaming. Now, for the first time ever on a REDMAGIC tablet, we get 2 USB Type-C ports, similar to Lenovo's Y700 lineup. REDMAGIC has now added a USB-C port in the center when in the landscape orientation. Unfortunately, we do have the return of the USB-C port that is off-centered like on the original Astra. We'll talk more about that during the Telescopic Controller portion. The 2 USB-C ports are not identical, and the off-center one, which is on the short side of the tablet, is a full USB 3.2 Gen 2 port with DisplayPort output and supports data as well as 75W fast charging. The long side USB-C port is only a USB 2.0, which does support that same 75W fast charging, but outside of that is limited to just audio output. We've got a front-facing 9MP camera and then a 13MP rear camera, and these are pretty decent, definitely a lot better than many other tablets that I've used in the past. The rear camera does quite well in a well-lit room or outdoors, but I don't think anyone in particular is buying an Astra 2 for the cameras, but these will do fine in a pinch. And in terms of audio, we have stereo speakers with one on each side when in the landscape orientation, and they sound pretty nice with good clarity and volume at the high end. These are DTS-X Ultra certified and are great for media consumption. The placement of the speakers are a bit frustrating when you have a telescopic controller attached, since they are going to be completely obstructed by any option that you choose to use. On board we have Bluetooth 6.0, which was upgraded from the original Astra, as well as Wi-Fi 7. This is all backed by an 8300 mAh battery, which is larger by 100 mAh compared to the original Astra. And this time around we've got up to 75W fast charging on board, and with the USB 3.2 Gen 2 port, it's capable of a full charge in just 57 minutes, which I actually tested myself with a slim Q charger that I had on hand here, and can confirm it achieved that, as well as a 68% charge in just 30 minutes. The battery delivered over 13.5 hours of on-screen time during my usual YouTube test at 1080p with 50% brightness and volume and the power saver option turned on, which as expected was better than what I tested with the original Astra last year. The Astra 2 also provides two-way reverse charging, which is a first for a REDMAGIC device, and it also offers charging separation to help preserve that battery when you're plugged in. Sadly, inside the package, REDMAGIC is no longer including a power adapter, and outside of the tablet itself, there's not a whole lot happening inside the box. Now, going back out of the box, the REDMAGIC 2 Astra ships with Android 16 and REDMAGIC OS 11, and I will say that if you are hoping for future updates to a newer version of Android, I would say don't expect much here, as REDMAGIC has not been great about this as seen in past products like the original Astra, and they typically don't receive newer builds of Android past the one that it ships with. So let's talk about the launch and pricing. The REDMAGIC Astra 2 will be available for the early bird offer in the middle of August, and then will be available for an open sale to the general public in late August. I've been informed that the dates can shift, so it's best to keep an eye out on the Astra 2 product page for the latest news. For the US market, the Astra 2 will be priced at $749 for the 12 and 256GB configuration, and then $849 for the 16GB and 512GB configuration. The Astra 2 will be available for sale in the following regions, with availability for Vietnam, Thailand, Turkey, and Brazil at a later date. I'd like to thank REDMAGIC for sending me this in advance so that I could properly test this, and as always, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So before we dive into gaming, I wanted to take a quick look at the thermals, since obviously REDMAGIC has focused on improving thermals on the Astra 2 since we are looking at a chipset that is more powerful than the prior generation. The company went back and added a larger vapor chamber for better heat dissipation. As we've seen in the past, they're also using liquid metal for the CPU to help transfer heat from the chip to the vapor chamber. And of course, the big thing that REDMAGIC is including as part of their aqua-core cooling system is the flowing liquid cooling, which we can actually see moving on the back of the tablet. Now, we saw this with the REDMAGIC 11 series phones, and now they have brought it over to the REDMAGIC Astra 2, which is a first for their tablets. Unfortunately, the liquid cooling aspect is mostly as we saw before, and it doesn't actually do a whole lot for thermal stability. We can see that with the liquid cooling turned on or turned off, the numbers are pretty close to being the same in that Rise preset. REDMAGIC does claim that the liquid cooling system is designed to draw heat away from the battery, and so that is possibly why we're not seeing it show up here in the 3D Mark tests. Now you can see that with the Rise preset, we are definitely getting a little bit of a drop in terms of performance, but this is pretty solid for a tablet that has no active cooling. I will say that when you push the tablet hard for much more demanding tasks, the entire chassis gets pretty hot to handle. And so it does mean that for very high-end type of gaming like PC gaming, you're most likely going to want an external cooler to get the most out of the device, and I imagine most will be using a controller attached or at least separately from the tablet. And speaking of that cooler, let's quickly take a look at some telescopic controller options, and naturally I have the REDMAGIC Shadow Blade 3, the GameSir X5S, GameSir G8 Plus, and the Absolute S8 as some examples of options that do fit this small tablet. Now you might want to go back and watch my old video of the first Astra tablet, because the same exact issue with that one applies here. And if you guessed it was the off-centered USB port on the short side, then you guessed correctly and deserve a delicious cookie for that. For whatever reason, the Astra 2 still has the same problem, and so that means that USB-C controls will sit kinda awkwardly with the Astra 2 attached. But not only that, the power button is still on the opposite side, and so that is something that will get pressed when you have a telescopic controller attached, which means you will need something to block that so it doesn't happen. As before, the best options are those that are Bluetooth based, and the Shadow Blade 3 is one of my personal favorites here. But if you're looking for something similar and substantially cheaper, GameSir's X5S is an excellent alternative, which I believe is going for only $40 on Amazon, and since GameSir makes both of these controllers, you are still getting similar quality. The biggest difference being the micro switches that are on the Shadow Blade as opposed to the membrane-based face buttons and D-pad that are on the X5S. You also lose out on the macro buttons that are available on the Shadow Blade 3, but personally for the price difference, I don't think it's a huge deal breaker. Now the cool thing is that all four of these controllers have no issues accommodating the REDMAGIC cooler, which is definitely nice. And so let's talk more about the cooler. So if we look at where the cooler sits on the Absolute S8 and the GameSir G8 Plus, it sits on the opposite side away from where the CPU is located, which is going to be the hottest point, and so it's probably not as effective as it can be. I think that the REDMAGIC Shadow Blade 3 or the GameSir X5S might actually be the better options when paired with the cooler, since it does get us closer to that hot point, but still not quite where we want it to go. Regardless, I know I'll be exploring other alternatives and maybe even checking out a magnetic type cooler instead. We're now finally ready to talk some gaming, and we're going to start out with native Android gaming first. When it comes to games that are available natively on Android and from the Play Store, I don't think it's going to be much of a surprise that the Astra 2 will do quite well with whatever is available for the platform. Something like Wuthering Waves will run at the highest settings allowed by the game, but with a 120 frames per second target thanks to the REDMAGIC game space, which will allow for frame insertion, and it's definitely a good way to flex that power of the 8 Elite Gen 5, which seemingly does not waver from the 120 frames per second target regardless of the action on screen. The same goes for something like Genshin Impact, which normally caps out at a 60 frames per second target, and will run on the Astra 2 at maxed out settings, but because of that frame insertion with game space, we can run the game at 120 frames per second with those maxed out settings, which is really awesome, and again seems to do quite well on here. The nice thing is that we have a lot of overhead here, and even running a game like Warframe with maxed out settings and a 60 frames per second target, we can get away with using just the balance preset, which will not only allow the tablet to generate less heat, but will also provide us with longer playtimes. Call of Duty Mobile is a great example of just how much power we have here with the 8 Elite Gen 5, since this game can run at a 165 frames per second using medium settings, which is the cap set by the developers, but we can achieve this with that same balance preset. As such, we have a lot of room to adjust here to suit the way that you prefer to play, and either prioritize the best in graphics or the highest frame rates. I will say that COD Mobile at the higher frame rate is super nice with the Astra's panel, allowing us to make use of the higher refresh rate display. And of course, I can't forget about Fortnite, which is another good way to showcase how far we can go with the 8 Elite Gen 5. And with Fortnite, I've got the game set to the highest settings possible, which are the epic settings, and a 120 frames per second target, and this is just an awesome experience with Fortnite and runs very well even during drops, and this is easily one of the best experiences I've had with this game on a tablet in terms of performance and visual fidelity. Finally, for one last Android game, I always like to use this as an opportunity to showcase some cool native Android ports, and one that I personally love is Ball X Pit, which is a game I've been addicted to on and off since it first came out back on PC, but now with an Android port, we can just enjoy this game natively on the Astra, and best of all, we can do it using just the Eco preset, which will really let us stretch that battery life, and regardless of the action on screen, the frame rate is as steady as can be. So let's switch on over to the emulation side, and of course, this is another area where we can really make use of the power that the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 provides us in the Astra 2. And emulation has always been a way to really push these cutting-edge chipsets. The reality is that we have enough power on hand that basically the power isn't the issue for most of the platforms that have been around for a while, and really just comes down to the actual compatibility and maturity of the emulator itself. With something like PlayStation 2 emulation using Nether SX2, we are able to achieve 5 times the native resolution of the PlayStation 2 in games like God of War 2, which means that we are targeting a 4K resolution, and obviously it goes beyond the panel resolution, but it also means that we can enjoy 4K output for the demanding games on the PS2 side. This also means that for a huge portion of the PS2 library, you will be able to enjoy this level of upscaling, but even for more problematic games, we can brute force performance. The same goes for the Gamecube and Wii with the Dolphin emulator, and with this we've maxed out the resolution scaling, which tops out at 6 times the native Gamecube resolution, and it proves to be no issue for games like F-Zero GX, which look absolutely stunning here. And again, this means that for Gamecube, power is no longer a constraint, and it just comes down to compatibility. But thankfully, since the 8 Elite Gen 5 isn't as new as it once was, when I first looked at the chipset, we do have solutions and fixes for any games that might be problematic. For example, I had an issue with Wave Race Blue Storm, but using the white Baylash driver and making use of the custom driver feature in Dolphin, it allowed me to resolve the issue. Likewise, Wii emulation with Dolphin proved to be very strong as well, and the Wii can be a bit more demanding than GameCube. So you might have to turn down the upscaling to 5 times the native resolution of the Wii, but again, we have so much overhead here that for any games that are more demanding, we are doing very well, and it's pretty amazing to see that we've reached this point when it comes to platforms like the GameCube, Wii, and even the PS2, and really, as I said, it just comes down to the maturity of the emulator and software, but for 6th generation and prior, you will be doing quite well with the Astra 2 overall. So while we're on the topic of Nintendo consoles, let's talk about the Switch with the Eden emulator. And again, the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 has a lot of power for us to work with, and in the earlier days of the 8 Elite, compatibility was not as strong, with plenty of issues in terms of graphics and the lack of driver support. Nowadays, things are better than ever with the 8 Elite chipsets, including the Gen 5, which does mean better driver support. Regardless, Switch emulation isn't perfect and still has ways to go, but the Switch library is massive and things are constantly evolving, but as you've probably seen on screen, Games like Donkey Kong Country HD, Bowser's Fury, and Super Mario Odyssey all run very well and performance can be really good, for example like in Donkey Kong Country HD or Bowser's Fury, which are both running at 2 times the native Switch resolution in docked mode, which is the equivalent of a 4K resolution. We have so much overhead here that something like Super Mario Odyssey can run in the balanced preset at the Switch's native resolution, but in docked mode for a 1080p resolution, which means that on this tablet we are running this game better than on an actual Switch when it's in its handheld mode, but it also means that with the balanced preset we can go easier on the battery and still enjoy solid picture quality. Emulation for me has always been an excuse to push the cutting edge, and of course I had to examine one of my favorite platforms, the PlayStation 3, using the RPCSX emulator and my favorite go-to game, Resogun, which I have running here at an upscaling of 300% of the native PlayStation 3 resolution, which means that Resogun is running here at a 4K resolution, and it's doing quite well, which is incredible. And I believe the first time that I've actually shown this game running at this resolution on the channel using this specific emulator. The same goes for a bit more demanding games like MotorStorm Pacific Rift, which I'm actually impressed by how well it runs here. And I do have this one just at 100% resolution scaling since there is some heavy shader compilation for this game, but I think it does show that power isn't necessarily the issue here, and the lack of maturity with the RPCSX emulator is very evident. This is very much a bonus platform because it's still got a ways to go. I actually have a whole video dedicated to this using the original Astra, which should give you an idea of just how much we can do with the RPCSX emulator. Finally, for the first time ever, I wanted to showcase something fairly new in the Android space, and that is Xbox 360 emulation, which is progressing at a very fast rate, and it's amazing what it's able to run already. For Xbox 360, I am using the X360 mobile emulator, and it's capable of running a decent amount of games even early on in its development. And as you can see, I did try one of my favorites from the Xbox Live Arcade, Hilo Milo, which is running very well here. Of course, I had to see how far we could push this emulator, and I was shocked that something like Gears of War 3 is playable with it and runs a lot better than I was expecting. It's really exciting to see this progress, and I can't wait to see how things mature with this emulator, and the best part of it all, the 8 Elite Gen 5 should do quite well in terms of the power needed to handle this emulator in the future. Now speaking of cutting edge, nothing beats PC gaming on Android when it comes to really pushing the hardware, and this will easily be the area where the power is needed, especially as we get into more demanding games. PC gaming has come a very long way in a very short amount of time, and it's truly amazing to see where we are currently with options like Gamehub, Gamenative, and Winlater all providing different ways to enjoy our PC games on our Android devices. This is easily an area where I have a lot of fun exploring the potential of the hardware, and specifically for the 8 Elite chipsets, we've come a long way for compatibility, which has improved so much. We're really seeing what we can do with something like the 8 Elite Gen 5, and it's pretty impressive and cool to see. Naturally, I tested a bunch of games, and will continue to do this well beyond this video since I am constantly amazed at what can be done here, and as you've probably already seen on screen, the results can be quite amazing, especially in older games like Blur, but also for lighter indie-style games like Megabomb, which is running well beyond 60 frames per second, and I did use the lowest settings here because I just wanted to see how many frames we could achieve at the native resolution of the Astra 2 and without any type of frame gen or upscaling tech. I think for many games of this type, and just indie games in general, expect that performance will be really good as long as the compatibility is there, which is a constantly evolving aspect of PC gaming on Android and will continue to improve as time goes on. As I always say, there's tens of thousands of games available on PC, and so the possibilities are enormous. Now I really wanted to push the Astra 2, so naturally I decided to check out some more demanding games since we've got the Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 on board. Also, I opted to not use an external cooler for any of this testing so that we can account for throttling, which does happen with the Astra 2 since it doesn't have any type of active cooling. So I tested a fairly recent release like Pragmata, and not only does this game run, I'd say it's actually quite playable on the Astra 2, staying at the locked 30 frames per second, using the minimum graphics preset and FSR set to balance with the resolution at 1080p. I'm honestly surprised at how smooth the game is running with these settings, and it's a very stable 30 frames per second, and I do think we have some room to adjust a little bit here, which is always a good thing. God of War is a game that certainly is no stranger to the channel, and one that I really like using for testing purposes, so that not only do I enjoy this game, but it's also one that lets me push this hardware and the possibilities. I like to check in with this game and see where we stand with performance and compatibility. For this footage, I have God of War set to use a 720p resolution with AMD's FSR set to balanced and then low settings. I'm honestly shocked that we're now staying above 30 frames per second with this game, which is pretty wild to me. I guess I'm a simple man, and I find this to be pretty incredible. And then for another game that I've featured before, Final Fantasy VII Remake, which I've set to use a 1080p resolution with low settings, and I'd say the game hovers around 45 frames per second. Now, if you don't mind messing around with frame generation, you're looking at something like 90 frames per second. And then if you drop the resolution down to 720p, this will get us closer to 60 frames per second without any frame generation. I use this game as an example of how we can adjust settings in different ways to achieve the balance that one might prefer with either performance or visual fidelity. And of course, I have to showcase Grand Theft Auto 5 since this is always a good demonstration of the performance that we can get with a device. I have GTA 5 set to use a 1080p resolution and just the normal graphics settings. And I'd say that we're doing quite well at this higher resolution, which is kind of insane to think about for a device that has no active cooling at this resolution as well. But I did want to take this as an opportunity to show how much the Astra 2 benefits from an external cooler like the one I showed earlier with the Shadow Blade 3. We can see that temperatures are staying lower than before, which is helping to keep the frame rate higher and realizing more of the potential of this chipset. So with all of that, we can see just the range of games that we can play thanks to apps like Gamehub and Gamenative. It's truly amazing to see just what is possible, and I can't wait to see where we end up in a few more months. I will say that for the higher end games, the temperatures definitely get way up there, and you can most definitely feel it on the tablet itself, which obviously isn't an issue if you're using a controller like I am, but this is definitely a case where an external cooler will probably be something that you'll want to consider if heavy PC gaming is your thing. Now, alternatively, you can have your desktop PC handle all of the heavy lifting and use the Astra as a streaming device to play games from your local PC with something like the combination of Apollo and Artemis, and with the Astra's beautiful display, this is one of my favorite use cases for a small form tablet like the Astra 2. The 8 Elite chips also handle decoding for streaming incredibly well, and I have Hades 2 here streaming from my local desktop PC at 185 frames per second, which the Astra 2's panel supports at its native resolution of 2400 by 1504, and we're looking at around 2 milliseconds of native decoding time, which is really incredible, since a game like Hades 2 feels very smooth and responsive with this configuration. And so we've reached the end of this video, and back when the Astra dropped, it was one and still is one of my favorite Android tablets that had just a few things that could be improved or changed for the follow-up. And with the Astra 2, that time is now here. And sadly, I think REDMAGIC missed an opportunity to really dominate this space. The off-centered USB-C port is one that stands out to me, and in a time where storage is getting to be prohibitively expensive, I wish they would provide the option for microSD expansion, as these tablets are getting more and more powerful and capable, and likewise, PC games take up a tremendous amount of storage that really limits what you can keep on the tablet at the same time. I think for many owners of the original Astra, especially if you got yourself one with 1TB of storage, I don't see a huge reason to upgrade here, and you might be better served waiting for the next round. So will you be sticking with your Astra, or perhaps looking at the competition for your small gaming tablet needs? Let me know down in the comments section. Until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.